Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm intrigued by the subject here. The topic of my presentation today is process safety regulation. I'm very experienced, knowledgeable. I've got quite a background in implementation of process safety management at operating facilities. Now, I'm also somewhat familiar with safety cases, having dealt with that back in the early 90s with Kerr McGee Corporation as we implemented a FSPO over in the North Sea, and safety cases were a fairly new feature there in the North Sea at that time. As corporate safety director for the company, I was quite involved in implementing there. So I'm familiar with how you go about implementing programs. I'm interested particularly now in how are those programs regulated? Who oversees the implementation of the regulation? So what really got me started was last fall. At the Mary Kay O'Connor Symposium in College Station in October last fall, Rafael More-Arasso, the chairman of the Chemical Safety Board, said something to the effect, it's been reported financial losses from refining incidents in the U.S. are 3 times higher than the counterparts within the EU cluster. That's not a verbatim quote. It was a verbal presentation he was making, but at that time, that's what really caught my attention, and particularly the 3 times improvement that was suggested when implicitly characterizing or implicitly comparing our process safety management, the PSM regulation, with the safety case regime that was kind of touted as the solution to the problem. The EU cluster, if you will, was thought to be driven by safety case regulation, whereas those of us in the U.S. were dealing with the PSM reg. I thought, can that be? And frankly, my initial reaction was, wow, is it possible? I mean, if it is true, if there is some way to be 3 times better and have 3 times less loss, well then, my gosh, you know, as a professional in the business, I think it's incumbent on us to go ahead and do it. Let's find out just exactly if that's the case. And so my challenge at this point was, let's take a look at this. And first, learn a little bit more about the safety case, tickle and find out the underpinnings of the claim. Why did the claim why was it stated that way? Examine the references that were cited, and then ask those people who developed that, you know, how did this happen? Give me a little more information, if you will, please. And so that's what I undertook then in preparation for this talk today. The next 4 slides then deal with safety case. You had a good presentation moments ago about PSM, so I'm certain that everybody here is very familiar with our PSM standard in the United States. But safety case, I'll give you 4 quick slides to kind of highlight what I think are important features of the safety case regime. I'll skip ahead and say in reality, there's not that much difference in the two, but be that as it may, let me go ahead and talk to you for a moment about safety case. I think safety case, particularly in the North Sea, offshore, really came about as a result of Lord Cullen's inquiry into the disastrous Piper Alpha explosion that was spoken about earlier, in which I think it was 167 people tragically lost their lives. That platform had just a sequence of events, all of which led to the complete destruction of the platform offshore in the UK waters. And Lord Cullen, in his subsequent follow-up, an excellent 2-volume report, by the way, and I commend it. It still stands, I think, as one of the key documents of how to go about managing complex hazardous systems well. He said this: a formal safety assessment of major hazards to demonstrate the potential major hazards and risks to personnel have been identified and appropriate action taken, appropriate controls provided. That's what he described as that's how he summed up what a safety case is. He went on to say this: operators, that is the entity that owns the hazardous operation, should be required to demonstrate this to a regulatory body, and it's inappropriate and impractical for the regulator themselves to undertake detailed auditing of the operator's compliance. Instead, that regulator should look at the operator's audits of themselves, and if there's something found to be questionable, then a more detailed audit can be undertaken by the regulator. So that's kind of the nature of safety case. Other people have commented on it, and Andrew Hopkins, for example, from Australia, has been real active talking about safety case, and he describes it, as you can see there, it's a proactive, risk-based performance approach that is specific to a facility, has those 5 functions, that is the risk assessment, requirement to make the case to the regulator, in other words, to set forth information that says we can operate this facility safely. It requires a competent and independent regulator. It requires workforce involvement, of course, and then a general duty of care imposed on the operator, that is, in most cases, to make certain that it's so-called a LARP, as low as is reasonably practicable, a LARP, A-L-A-R-P. So that's the general duty. Another commentator, Nancy Levinson, professor at MIT, describes safety case in the following: it's a structured argument for why the system is safe, and she says, I thought interestingly, there are 2 types of regulations. She divides them into 2 camps: prescriptive regulations, such as we see with FAA, particularly civil aviation, and then performance-based or goal-setting type of regulation that would characterize the safety case. I would also assert in many ways it characterizes PSM. So that's a little bit about safety case. You have to put a case forward to the regulator. The regulator has to be competent to look at it, pass judgment on it, or at least stand silent, not object, and one would go about then implementing a safety case protocol or procedure for regulating that operation. How then did the Chemical Safety Board come to state that the safety case is 3 times better, by implication, than the process safety management standard? Well, I kind of diagrammed it in this fashion. Their argument, or their statement that they assert, is embodied in a May 2014 document, the title page of which is on the right there, that dealt with the Chevron Richmond refinery fire. And in that paper, they point to a 2013 University of California, Berkeley report to the governor of California that was conducted by a group that went around the state and listened and came forth with some recommendations on how to go about implementing oversight of refineries in the state of California. And what they did was point backward to Swiss Re, the reinsurance operator, the second largest, I guess, in the world, who have been on record putting forth certain statements. And those statements, the UC Berkeley folks said, safety case regulation is 3 times better than other types of regulation. I'll show you how that came about. What I actually did was go ahead and dig down in the footnotes and find the name of an individual who actually wrote those Swiss Re reports, a fellow named Ernst Zerngast, and I called him up one day in August. I said, Mr. Zerngast, Would you mind telling me how this information came to pass? I'm really interested, and I want to see how it happened that you came forth with this information and what it's based on. He was happy to communicate with me. His first reaction when I introduced myself said, I'm just a fellow in the U.S. and I want to know a little more about this. He said, "Oh dear." I didn't want to cause him any anxiety, so I said, "No, this is just, I want to write a paper, I want to explain what I'm learning here." And he then loosened up and was able to communicate and tell me a little bit about what the basis was. He pointed to some data from this Willis Advisors, a company that claims to aggregate loss claims around the world. And unfortunately, that's available for a fee that I wasn't willing to pay for. But in any case, what Swiss Re did was take that data, think that it represented worldwide data, and they grouped different countries to allow conclusions to be made. And what they came up with were 4 different groupings. They called, Mr. Zerngast called the first one the Anglo group. And that's, CSB later took that to mean the USA. And by that, they took that to mean the PSM regulation. But in point of fact, the Anglo group actually has half of the roster, half of the 4 groups up there that use safety case regulation. UK, Australia, and one of them, the US, uses PSM, and to a certain extent, Canada, somewhat like a PSM regulation. The second, third, and fourth groups were the EU group, that is Europe, Singapore, you can read those, but it also includes Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Egypt. The rest of the Middle East is in the 4th category down there. And then Russia's the 3rd group there that constitutes Eastern Europe primarily. That was his cluster of 4 different groups, and what he then did was look at their losses. I hope you can read these numbers, but during the period 1985 through 2006, that is the 4th column over, you can see the loss burden, or the number of losses, and then finally on the rightmost column, the actual loss burden, millions of dollars, $980 million in 2 things: business interruption, property damage. And $980 million was in the Anglo group, $350 million in the EU group, 15 in Russia, and 260 in the other. You can see it adds up to $1.6 billion in losses over that 21-year period, which seemed kind of low to me, but nonetheless, I think we'll see in a moment, it is low. It really is not anywhere close to a full compilation of worldwide data. Nonetheless, those top 2 numbers, 980 and 350, are where the threefold improvement came about. That assertion that the Anglo, or the US, loss record is 3 times worse than is Europe. So you can see it's based on that data right there. Having said all that, I was I thought, well, this doesn't get me where I'm going with regard to comparing USA PSM to safety case. That's what I had heard was the issue, and that's why safety case was so rigorously put forth as a good way to regulate hazardous materials. I don't find that to be the case. So what then what was I able to do? Had to look for other sources of information, and the one that I really spent some time looking at in particular was Marsh & McLennan's 100 largest losses for the period 1974 through 2013. That's an excellent document, and I commend it to those of you in the process safety business because it, again, highlights, it helps us not lose that institutional memory, because it really talks about the losses that are serious and severe. Piper Alpha, of course, or I think that might be BP Macondo featured on the front there. I tabulated the data. I put all kinds of different columns together and tried to make sense out of the data that was presented, and then I came up with 3 charts that I'll share with you right now. We'll see if I get any kind of a reaction from you. Of the 20 largest losses, 13 of those occurred since 1992. I picked 1992 as kind of the date on which we in the US have PSM, folks in the UK and Europe, Australia had safety cases, and so I started to look at data from 1992. Of the 20 largest losses recorded by Marsh & McLennan, and by the way, they extrapolate those cost numbers, 13 of them have occurred in that period there, that 22-year period. The 3 that were shown in blue on the top right quadrant, OSHA PSM, would be Williams Olefins, a hurricane in the Gulf Coast, and Kuwait. The one in the red on the right side is what I call a prescriptive regulation, that is Minerals Management Service and BP Macondo. Down on the bottom right, on the that greenish color, there are 3 there that represent Ekofisk in Norway, a French explosion, ammonium nitrate as it turns out, and a gas plant in Australia. And then finally, over on the left are 6 that come about from everything else. I really didn't know just exactly what the regulatory regime in Argentina looks like, frankly, and I didn't have the time to really tack it down well. But many of those are Latin American, Petrobras, as you can see. In any case, comparing OSHA PSM to safety case, there's really no net conclusion from that particular graph there, so I can't come up with a conclusion there. If I look at refining, it's a different story, though. Here again, these are such small numbers that I'm not sure that one can come up with a robust answer, but since 1992, of those 100 largest incidents by Marsh & McLennan, 26 of them involved refineries. And of those 26, 12 were regulated under the PSM standard. It included, as you can read, 3 from California, 3 in Texas, 2 in Mississippi, and so forth. 3 in Canada, all of which were tar sands. And again, Kuwait. 2 with safety case, Singapore and UK incident. And then again on the left, all others, Italy, Japan, France, Argentina, and so forth. Here, you can see 12-2. That sort of suggests there may be something there with regard to refining, but I'm not certain that it really tells us that much. I do know that of that 12, 2 of them, or maybe 3, were related to hurricanes or weather events. So is that a PSM regulated issue? It's debatable, but if you take away 3 from 12, then you're left with 9. The whole point is we're dealing with very small numbers here anyway, so it's hard to get a good answer. But in any case, there may be a glimmer of a suggestion that at least in refining, those of us in the PSM world may have ways to improve things. Finally, I look at offshore upstream, that is oil and gas production offshore. And here again, the picture is decidedly uncertain. 4 incidents happened in the Gulf of Mexico, including Macondo. That I characterize as Minerals Management Service prescriptive. 4 of them occurred in regimes managed under safety case regulation. You can read what they are, Ekofisk, Australia, and leaking risers and so forth. And then again, 7 in Egypt and Venezuela and India and so forth, which I really couldn't characterize. In any case, I come up with no good answer there comparing Minerals Management Service prescriptive regs to those in safety case regulation. So in conclusion, these are what I believe the data tells me. We've got very small numbers here. One severe incident skews things dramatically. so it's difficult to come up with a good answer. Swiss Re, the data on which CSB hung their hat in the Chevron Richmond report, I don't think withstands scrutiny. The Swiss Re data is clustered in such a way that you cannot get any good information out of that particular path or that particular set of information. So I discount that. What we do have with regard to the Marsh/McLennan data is not normalized with regard to the number of refineries. We compared 12, as you recall, incidents under MMS or under PSM versus 2 in safety cases. I don't know if there's 6 times as many complex refineries under PSM as compared to safety case regulation or not. So it's not normalized. Not all data is reported. You can see, I think it was a grand total of $15 million in Russian losses, and I just, off the top of my head, I'm not sure that's right. And then finally, the main conclusion, the data don't allow firm conclusions to be made as to the crucial issue that I set forth, safety case versus PSM. Finally, here's my suggestions. There's no magic answer. There can't be. Those of us in the business are working hard to use the regulations under which we operate, but it comes about not through compliance with the regulation necessarily, but from the second point there, hard work and scrupulous attention to the best practices set forth by groups like CCPS. And there are exemplars that exist, and I call these particularly to your attention. Nuclear submarines, as Professor Levinson is fond of reporting. She says, take a quick look at a nuclear submarine. They are operating in very severe environments with high hazards, and yet for 48 years, I believe it is, they've had 0 upsets, 0 incidents, tragic incidents in the U.S. nuclear submarine business. Prior to the implementation of their present management of safety, they would have about 1 tragic submarine incident a year, 1 a year, and they transformed that such that today they have 0 in 48 years. So it's, I think, worthy of examining what they do. Finally, I point to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I think we in the chemical industry have a lot to learn from the way the U.S. NRC regulates, in particular, what they call the informed risk, integrated, the initials are IRIDM, integrated risk-informed decision-making. In other words, doing the things that we're doing, complying with prescriptive standards for certain things like fire protection and vessel protection, overpressure protection, and yet inform our decisions with regard to those kinds of upsets with probabilistic numbers as well. And so looking at risk, integrated risk-informed decision-making. I think we can take a lot of lessons from other people dealing with the same kinds of hazardous materials that we're dealing with. Very well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. That was an outstanding presentation, a lot of good thought going into an important question. Let me open the floor for questions. Please identify yourself and your affiliation.
My name is Ken Arnold. I'm with Worley Parsons. I'm really an offshore guy, and I can't tell you how thankful I am for the work that you have done and demonstrated here. I almost want to kiss you, because I've been fighting this issue for a long time now. One of the reports on the Macondo that came out, I think it was the NAE NRC report, made a similar statement. You're 3 times more likely to die on an offshore platform in the US because we don't have a safety case than you are in the North Sea. And I've tried to find out where that came from and couldn't. And I suspect it has some relationship similar to this. One of the things I found extremely, and not only that, but the Chemical Safety Board, in the first two parts of their investigation of Macondo, and has really focused on that and really focused on, oh my God, you have to do safety cases. Society of Petroleum Engineers was asked to review the draft of that report a week and a half before it was circulated. So it had probably already been printed. But three of us, 4 SPE, was asked to review that report. All three of us independently, including one guy from the UK, said that every statement they made in that report to try and substantiate where a safety case would have resulted in a different answer was wrong. It has become something, I think there's a bunch of consultants coming out of Europe who can see a good way to make a lot of money doing safety cases. I'd just like to point to one thing that I didn't know. This Marsh report is fantastic. Okay, if there were 4 Gulf of Mexico major incidents offshore and 4 in the UK, and you look at the activity level in the Gulf of Mexico compared to the activity level in the UK, or in Europe, or in the North Sea, if you will, let's say the safety case area of the North Sea, there is no comparison. We have much more activity. We have many more different operators of various capabilities involved here. Now, I've been preaching since 1994 when API came out with RP 75, which is the offshore equivalent of 750, that it should be made mandatory by the MMS. It was not. It was made voluntary compliance. In 2010, it was made mandatory. And once you make PSM, which is what RP 75, the government calls it SEMS and not PSM, but once you make that mandatory, you're basically doing the same thing in a safety case, except you're not going through the BS of coming up with a quantitative risk analysis that shows you've met a LARP. And I love you. Thank you very much.
Ray?
I'm not looking for a kiss here or anything, but as Steve knows, at Mary Kay O'Connor, we have a couple of graduate students that have been working on this very same thing. We've tried to track down a couple other. You looked at the factor of 3. There are some other quotes out there by people, and just like your analysis, we kind of hit dry dirt when we kind of got down to the bottom. And you know, the issue is there aren't good data. I mean, the Marsh is one source, and as you know, we've looked at spills, fatalities, a variety of things. They aren't all necessarily on a common basis, but from what we've gathered over a year, we certainly can't conclude that one is superior to the other. But thank you for your presentation.
Work with your folks on that too. I look forward to doing that on TAC. Yeah. Well, very good. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Kelly might have. Oh, a hard question from Kelly. No, an easy one.
Please
Kelly
identify
Thomas.
yourself and your affiliation.
Kelly Thomas with Baker Risk. I just want to know if you fed this back to the CSB, and if so, what they said.
I have not. I frankly hadn't thought to do so, Kelly, but I have promised that I would give the presentation back to Mr. Zerngast in Zurich. Very nice guy, and he was very forthright in explaining what he came up with. And I think it's safe to say he didn't anticipate that it would take a life of its own, as it seems to have done.
Well, I would certainly encourage you to share this with the CSB.
be happy
Perhaps
to do it.
they'll learn to check a little better.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kelly.
Have a couple more questions.
Just one quick comment. I retired from Saudi Aramco in '09, and Saudi Arabia, both the chemical and the oil, have been on PSM, not whatever the safety case is. So I was involved in developing that at Saudi Aramco. So,
Okay, so
move that date over.
PSM is clearly the regulatory regime embraced by Saudi Arabia.
Right,
Okay.
that's it.
Is that both onshore and in the onshore and the,
Yes.
okay, great,
Yep.
thank you. That'll be helpful.
Mark Young, Chiota International. I've worked in 3 different phases of the industry, onshore pipeline, onshore plant as well as offshore. Had lengthy discussions with Ken over the Macondo incident and how to deal with it. One of the key things the previous presentation, people that don't know they don't know. That's a given. And the problem with your risk-based ones is if we don't put minimums out there in the form of something like an API standard, then we get people that are young, come in, don't know what the risks are, trying to run the meetings, overrun everybody else, and establish then what the safety case is. So it's very important that we have a minimum standard. That's why I lean towards having more of a somewhat prescriptive minimum level than having the risk base on top of that. And I don't care whether it's called PSM or safety case, that's what we need.
I'm not sure if this is going along, but one thing that rings in my mind from Lord Cullen, as he wrote his 1990 follow-up to the tragic Piper Alpha, he said something to the effect of this. He said, all this good probabilistic work that you see in some of these safety case presentations shouldn't fill you with a lot of confidence. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines, if the operator, if the company who is operating the facility, that platform or that chemical process, if that operator doesn't understand what's going into those probability analyses and can almost do it themselves, then they're kind of starting to get a little bit over detailed. I think you can start to lose the forest for the trees. In other words, if you spend a lot of time on real detailed probabilistic analysis and don't spend the time with the hard work and scrupulous attention, I think you can lose your way, and that's what we can't afford in our business.
I agree. Thank you.
I understand the reason you challenging the data from the Swiss Re report. I noticed you have a location in Las Vegas. Probably you also work on the nuclear safety.
No, interestingly, chemical business in Nevada.
Chemical business.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
And no risks.
Go ahead, Jake.
This, thank you to Steve for bringing this up, but this is a very active discussion in the United States and the world about what kind of regulation we ought to have here. Just as Steve say, you need very competent regulators in order to establish the safety case. And the other thing to remember, we're talking about refineries, but we have 14,000 chemical facilities in the United States that would need to would have to have a safety case to be reviewed. Just let's remember that. Let's thank Stephen again.